Our next speaker is Maria Simakova. Maria is obtained an MA and an MTH from St. Vladimir Seminary. Well, the MTH is just at the point of completion. Her thesis is on reading and rereadings of Judas. She is a doctoral student in the Faculty of Divinity of Trinity College and a teacher in our program of Scripture and Theology in the Orthodox Christian Studies program. Her particular interests include the intersection of critical thought and method in theology.
I'm very short, so you have to bear with me. Your Eminences, Your Graces, Reverend Fathers, esteemed professors, brothers and sisters in Christ. I want to thank you for this wonderful opportunity to participate in this symposium. Indeed, His Grace's Ioan Casian's invitation took me by surprise, because I did not think I possessed the qualifications to be here. Quite obviously, I am not a bishop, whose very function in the Orthodox Church is rightly to divide the word of the truth. Nor do I yet hold the venerable title of Doctor of Theology. Yes. Is that better? Yes. Good. Very well, you might ask. So, where does the amateur like me get the sheer cheek not only to accept this invitation, but to choose an ambitious, not only to say arrogant, title, theological truth-telling in the post-Constantine world? Perhaps the best way to answer this question is to tell a personal story. Last year, as I began the PhD program, I was in a crisis as a thinker, a writer, a theologian. In fact, I was not even sure that I was meant to be a thinker, a writer, a theologian. What, after all, was theology? How did one go about it? Even more fundamentally, why did one go about it, after centuries of discourse and an avalanche of writing? What was I after? At lowest points, my favorite exercise was to browse the theological shelves in the library. Look at all those books, I told myself. Look at this labor, hours spent, ambition, certitude of calling. Look at this dust, uncreased bindings, dispersion, oblivion. Do you want to become one of them? My malaise had nothing to do with loss of faith. On the contrary, it arose from the fissure, the discord, between the Christ I breathed and felt in my bones, the Christ I glimpsed in human faces, in scriptures and liturgy, and the Christ, or rather endless talk about Christ, that I encountered in classes and theological books. This Christ of classes and theological books was himself a theologian. He liked to assert, argue, critique, convince, judge, and generally carry the day. He liked to impress, preach, prove his point, and vanquish the opponent. At his better moments, he enjoyed building intricate metaphysical systems, writing florid poetry, and in a terribly contemporary fashion, contemplating God without being. If this Christ were in one of my classes, he would be an insufferable know-it-all. So I struggled to point a finger on the problem. Was my malaise a crisis of method? After all, the questions, what is theology, what do we do when we speak the truth theologically, have assumed a central place in the post-Christian world. In 20th and 21st century, most creative theological output, and especially debate, strives to resolve these very dilemmas, sometimes to the exclusion of other traditional topics. Moreover, the very question of truth has been on our minds in the past few centuries. On the one hand, there is the relativization of the concept of truth. On the other, the questioning of our very ability to arrive at it. So what is theological truth speaking? One familiar question, which you have probably heard one familiar answer, which you have probably heard many times, deploys etymology. Theology is a logos about a theos, a disciplined discourse about God. This approach frames God as a substantive entity, something out there. And moreover, an entity about which truthful, objective, and verifiable propositions can be made. Curiously, this way of thinking of theology appeals to both conservatives and liberals alike, even if they disagree on procedure and method. Conservative writers usually operate with categories of revelation, irrefutable authorities, the Bible, tradition. Liberal thinkers often appeal to some version of scientific method. The direction of our truth-speaking changes. One formulates propositions from God, or towards God, as it were, but the results are strikingly similar. Another common answer privileges experience, feelings, and existential orientation. In the Orthodox world, this can be probably summarized as an adage: a theologian is one who prays, the one who prays a theologian. Eschewing logical and propositional discourse, this kind of theological truth-speaking relies on suggestive, often paradoxical, symbolic language, constructs narratives, and proffers authentic encounter and transformation. Theologians of this stamp often highlight the personal or creative nature of their enterprise. Since they're trying to F the ineffable, in a catchy postmodern phrase, the logic of their discourse is poetic and their results provisional. Nevertheless, even these theologians claim that some truth about God or about our relationship with Him can be captured through their discourse. The truth and transformation attained are authentic, meaning that all the other truth and transformations are inauthentic. So, in our Orthodox tradition, there has recently been developed a third way of approaching the question: what do we do when we speak theologically? Some of you, or many of you, are probably familiar with Father John Bear's work, who approaches the question of theological truth-speaking as talking about Christ as God. He does so from an exegetical and eschatological perspective, and I'm not going into details of that because he will read his books for himself. This approach, this exegetical, eschatological, Christological approach to theologizing is helpful because it shows what is Christian about our theology. After all, even the ancient Greeks had a logos about the theos as well. Nevertheless, like the logical rational method or the existential mythological method, this approach still talks about a transformative encounter or about our interaction with texts. The sum total of its value for my own truth-speaking is content. But for me, perhaps the most alarming feature of all of those approaches is their unlimited potential for coercion, violence, verbal warfare, and hubris. In one way or another, all theologians name and define God and Christ. In one way or another, we all make substantive truth claims about their being and actions, purposes and significance. We strive to contain and, in some sense, shape our objects. In scriptural terms, we engage in idol-making, even if we strive to delineate methodological strategies to minimize this danger. Indeed, the very method by which we try to make sure that the Christ of our theologies is a true, living Christ, the truth of the gospel, often becomes another idol. Our collective abject fear of being wrong is a symptom of this malady. Apart from the quite real danger of being accused of heresy, we believe we can capture Christ and make him do our bidding. If we strike on the right set of dogmatic propositions, the right system, the right method, the right way of living the Christian life. Salvation belongs to us, not to the world. This desire for possessing truth in theological certitude translates into how we theologians talk to each other and to lay people. We love to find faults in the systems and methods of our opponents. We glory in argument and confrontation. We brandish incontrovertible proofs and scriptural trump cards. We cherish our victories. Even the inclusive ways of doing theology quickly become defensive stances, striving to debunk or ridicule the more exclusive methods. Once we hone our arguments in interdepartmental skirmishes, we turn to preaching and teaching. Here we proclaim our Christ, our God, and our gospel as revealed and unassailable truths. We strive for conversion and firmly believe that it rests on the quality of our preaching and the validity of our claims. Without us, the gospel would be forgotten. Is it surprising that in return for all of those Herculean labors, we expect gratitude, obedience, and silence from the laity? Finally, we believe that the style of our theologizing is not important. As long as we have the right content or the right starting point, we can use systematics or dialectics, narrative, or poetry. As I struggled with all those questions, something came to mind that I think relates to our symposium. Isn't this way of theologizing, doesn't this way of theologizing have its roots in the Constantinian Empire, in the spread of Christianity as the religion of the empire? The Council of Nicaea, in this sense, makes an important turn in the history of Christian theology, because the doctrinal propositional truths about God and Christ formulated by the Fathers became de facto an imperial law. You had to follow them. In the post-Constantinian and post-Christian world, this does not work anymore. The most perfect theological exercise I could write will not become the standard to which all people must accede when they speak about God. And yet we fall back on it as almost a knee-jerk reaction. Or we turn to the scientific objective discourse, basically trying to accomplish the same goals. So where can we look? And let me make just a footnote that I'm not saying that dogmatic or experiential theology has nothing to teach us. Obviously, over the centuries, many fruits have come out of those discourses. But is there another way of theological truth-talking? And can we find it in the foundational documents of our faith and in the scriptures? Can we find it in our tradition? As I reflected on this question, I realized that when Christ, Paul, or the Fathers speak, we recognize them as speaking the truth, truth-talking. What makes for this recognition? How do they speak this way? A curious phrase emerged in my mind, a phrase that we often think about or deploy when we kind of speak about truth in scriptures. And that is the famous Pauline paradigm of speaking the truth with boldness. Mostly we focus on the truth part, right? And we try to ascertain what is that truth. And if we do speak about boldness, we just presuppose that it is by the very virtue of Paul, the brave missionary going about Hellenistic world and preaching the gospel, always at the risk of losing his own life. As I read through not just the early patristic, but also the Hellenistic philosophical tradition, I realized that that notion of boldness, or parousia, was actually a very familiar thing in that world. As somebody who speaks with boldness, or with parousia, whether a philosopher or a theologian, is a very specific character. He emerges as, his acts of truth-telling are neither objective nor neutral. A parousiastic theologian has a bond between truth and the person speaking. He personally commits himself to the truth he states. He binds himself to this truth and is bound by it and for it. Secondly, a theologian speaking the truth in the parousiastic mode opens up, establishes, and really sustains the risk of provoking his interlocutor and the risk of irritating them and making them angry. He opens himself up to violence by definition. Think of Christ walking the roads of Judea and how offensive the gospel was preached. Think of Paul constantly undermining his relationships with the ancient communities. Think of 2 Corinthians, for instance, which is all about speaking the truth with boldness. He really offended the community. Whatever he was saying, and the content is a little less important in that sense, whatever he was saying really offended the audience. Moreover, somebody who speaks the truth in this way does not impose himself or herself on the community. The parousiastic truth speaker always has to be accepted. He has to be chosen. And in that case, he or she does not possess any inner qualifications to speak. He doesn't have to be professional. She doesn't have to be a bishop. Your choice, the choice of the audience, makes me a truth speaker to you. Thus, this mode of truth speaking is a relational, not a contemplative or informative, and an active, fraught with violence, act. Moreover, I discovered that in this kind of theological truth-speaking, style matters. Style and rhetorical arrangements are not dispensable adornments. It is the very flesh and blood of truth-speaking in this moment. You may ask why that is. It is because in order for the text to work on you, in order for the text to shape and mold you, in order for my theological truth-telling not to impose on you with objective truths, the text has to open up a space within which you can confront not only it, but Christ. In the sense that the parasiastic text has to be elusive, it has to be masked, it has to work by inversions, paradoxes, subversions, even lies. This may come as a surprise to you, because after all, is Christ a liar? Well, think about the Gospel of John, the 7th chapter, when the brothers of Christ approach him and ask, "Are you going to go up to Jerusalem to participate in the feast?" He says, "No, I will not go. You should come without me." They depart, and he follows them. Did Christ lie? Or was that an opportunity to meet him in a different way? You may think about this chapter especially because it isn't there that he is defined as truth-speaking in an ecclesiastic manner, speaking the truth with boldness. And his discourse is in fact about his death and resurrection. Finally, this kind of theological truth-speaking privileges failure, performative failure, as the very central feature of its flesh. Again, think of the truth of the Gospels. Think of the Christ of the Gospels. He fails spectacularly and publicly as an apologist, as a witness to his own relationship to God, as an interpreter of scriptures. He fails as a theologian. He dies on the cross precisely because he fails to convince or coerce people into believing that he is the Son of God, the true King, the embodiment of wisdom. And yet out of that failure comes out the conversation between the two of his disciples on the road to Emmaus. Something stuck in their minds. They were moved by the very truth-speaking of Christ on the cross. They talk about him on the road. They ask questions. They're unsure. There is no certitude. And it is this space of uncertainty that allows the risen Lord to enter into the conversation. So, how do we write texts as theologians that speak the truth in this manner? Apart from performative failure, apart from establishing a relationship, a personal relationship with our audience, apart from always responding to Christ himself as a truth speaker in this manner, I believe we have to think about a new style of theology. It's not a new style. If you look through the fathers, Gregory of Nazianzus and Clement of Alexandria, Augustine of Hippo, in our times maybe even Father Dumitru Staniloae, in fact work in this manner. They take up old styles, for instance, and reverse or invert their rules. They break their game. But also there is another mode of truth-speaking that could result in a text that would be probably abrasive or offensive in that world. For instance, can we write a theological text that speaks with passion? That takes authority not as something that shuts down dialogue, but as a point of departure? Can we not write theology in a dialogical framework where we respond to the truth-speaking of others and in turn to the audience? Moreover, can we write theology in which the very language of our writing becomes the space in which Christ can speak? This kind of theological truth-speaking in a post-Constantine or post-Christian world cannot be done in a neutral, objective, scientific voice. We cannot speak with propositions. Our words must move, shape, and set the soul ablaze. Those are the texts that speak of the eros of God, the longing for each other. And they perform that eros in their body. So, obviously, as a student of theology or as an aspiring theologian, I do not have answers. I have not arrived at the point where I'm writing texts like this. So I hope you take this as a sketch, a mere direction in which I'm going. And I'm very interested to hear what you think about this way of theological truth-speaking. Again, I'm very aware that it may be provocative and even offensive, because I do want to sidestep the questions that we usually talk about the content, objective truth, and even personal relationships. But I invite you to reflect on this and perhaps share your responses with me. And hopefully, in our dialogue, in the way that we talk to each other, Christ, the living truth, will come and make our soul ready and fine for the sowing of his